Hiya there, good to see you again. Back for part 2 of our Bible study on the Old Testament book of Ruth. So we're going to get stuck right in, and so hopefully you've got your Bible and you are ready to go. So last time we stepped into a story about a family that lived some 3,000 years ago. And they lived during a torrid time in the life of the people of Israel, known as the period of the Judges. To escape famine and certain starvation, the head of the family, Elimelech, took a calculated risk and journeyed with his wife, Naomi, and their 2 sons, some 50 miles southeast across the Dead Sea to the foreign land of Moab, where there was no such famine. What follows is the misery and heartache of Naomi, spanning some 10 years or more, who first had to endure the death of her husband and then both her childless sons, leaving her and her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law destitute. Now, Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth, a Moabite woman, who despite Naomi's begging, has loyally stayed with her mother-in-law, and they are living back in Bethlehem. And their first concern is how to support themselves, how to find food for their survival. So let's find out together what happens next. We're going to read Ruth chapter 2, and we're going to read the first 17 verses. So here we go. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. One day Ruth said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the fields to gather leftover grain behind anyone who will let me do it." And Naomi said, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you," the harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked his foreman, "Who is that girl over there?" And the foreman replied, "She is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes' rest over there in the shelter." Boaz went over and said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting, and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to bother you. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked. "I am only a foreigner." "Yes, I know," Boaz replied, "but I also know about the love and kindness you have shown your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully." "I hope I continue to please you, sir," she replied. "You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me even though I am not worthy as your workers." At lunchtime, Boaz called to her, "Come over here and help yourself to some of our food. You can dip your bread in the wine if you like." So she sat with his harvesters, and Boaz gave her food, more than she could eat. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up, and don't give her a hard time." So Ruth gathered barley there all day, and when she beat out the grain that evening, it came to about half a bushel. Okay. So a new character is introduced, and as in the case of the other characters, first his status and family connection are given, and finally his name, Boaz. The meaning of the name Boaz is somewhat obscure, but broadly it can be explained as, in him there is strength. More importantly, he is a man of substance from Elimelech's family. We already know from the end of chapter 1, that is, that Naomi and Ruth arrive in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Because Israel's climate is quite moderate, there are 2 harvests each year, with the barley harvest taking place in the spring and the wheat harvest in the autumn. When the wheat and barley were ready to be harvested, labourers were hired to cut down the stalks and tie them into bundles. Israelite law, as explained in both Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 to 10, and again in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19. The law not only demanded that the corners of the fields not be harvested, but that any grain that was dropped was to be left for the poor. Therefore, because Naomi and Ruth had no means of providing for themselves, Ruth suggests that she go out into the fields to glean the grain, and Naomi agrees. Surprise, surprise. Ruth just happens to choose a field that belongs to Boaz. Lucky coincidence or divine intervention? Ruth, of course, at this stage does not know who the field belongs to or of its connection to Naomi. But thanks to the author of this story, we indeed do. It is good to reflect on God's provision for us each, isn't it? I often say that God helps those who help themselves. And this situation, on the face of it, certainly required Ruth to be willing to do something to help her situation first. Boaz's greeting in verse 4 and the subsequent reply from the harvesters tells us an enormous amount about the character of the man and how well respected he was. And I'm just going to reread that verse. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you," the harvesters replied. He is a true man of God. He cares about both his workers and any poor strangers on his land. He is curious about Ruth, and he is concerned for her welfare, ensuring that she is well looked after and provided for. But one can't help wonder, why such a deep interest? True, women gleaning alone were not always safe, and we are led to believe that Ruth is a young woman. and therefore she is potentially a target for some less scrupulous workers. So we can understand Boaz's insistence that she remain within his field only. But even so, we can also read between the lines, can't we? Boaz certainly admires her loyalty and kindness to Naomi and acknowledges the sacrifices that she has made which have brought her to this point in her life, where in order to survive, she has to glean grain. But the reader, you and I, we are not fooled. He also likes this young woman, and he likes her a lot. Spending his lunchtime with her and going out of his way to ensure that she gathers more grain than she could ever have hoped for, and far more than she and Naomi needs. Half a bushel is about 18 litres. That's an awful lot of grain. Ruth, for her part, appears throughout these encounters as hard-working, humble, and indeed very grateful. However, what is most significant is the way in which the relationship between the two develops. At first, Boaz refers to Ruth in verse 5 as girl or young woman. And then in verse 8, he addresses her as my daughter, the same term used by Naomi, suggesting that Boaz quickly feels some paternal protection towards Ruth, or understands and accepts her as family. Ruth equally changes the way she refers to Boaz. At first, in verse 10, she refers to herself as a foreigner. But then in verse 13, she addresses Boaz as my lord or sir, and refers to herself as his servant. On the surface, this is a wonderful display of a God-fearing, wealthy farmer going above and beyond to help someone who, through no fault of their own, has fallen on hard times. And if that was the end of the story, then yes, it would be a wonderful demonstration and example of the type of kindness and generosity that as Christians, God expects us to show in our own lives. But the story is beautifully crafted, and we know there is much, much more to come as a result of this encounter between Boaz and Ruth. So we read on, and we read verses 18 to 23. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the food that was left over from her lunch. So much, Naomi exclaimed. Where did you gather all this grain today? Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you. So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she had worked. And she said, the man I worked with today is named Boaz. May the Lord bless him, Naomi told her daughter-in-law. He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers. Then Ruth said, what's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with his harvesters until the entire harvest is completed. This is wonderful, Naomi exclaimed. Do as he said. Stay with his workers right through the whole harvest. You will be safe there, unlike in other fields. So Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's fields and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she worked with them through the wheat harvest. But all the while, she lived with her mother-in-law. I wonder if you could imagine Naomi at home all day worrying about Ruth. Was she right to agree to her going out into the fields? Did she manage to keep herself safe there? Was there even enough grain to make her visit worthwhile, to make that day worthwhile? Naomi's experience of life, remember, is a bitter one. She's telling everyone around her to call her Mara, for her life was bitter and it was empty. How relieved and surprised she must have been to see Ruth literally staggering back with 18 litres of grain. That was heavy. And not just that, but also bringing back her lunch for Naomi to eat. We can tell, can't we? Food is scarce. She's saved back some of her lunch for her mother-in-law. No wonder that Naomi is full of questions. But more significantly, even though her life's path could have destroyed her faith, she was ready in verse 19 to praise God for the outcome of Ruth's day in the field. That's quite something, isn't it? I think. We miss that perhaps. Of all the things that Naomi's been through, she praises God. She says, "May the Lord bless the one who helped you." Her faith is still there. We can deduce that Naomi had no idea that Boaz lived so near. Otherwise, the chances are that she would have already made herself known to this kinsman or relative. She couldn't have known that he was within the vicinity. But once she hears his name, she recognises not only the importance of the encounter, but the potential future significance, referring to him in verse 20 as a family redeemer or kinsman. The redeemer or the kinsman, this is the one that's legally responsible for protecting the interests of the family. His main obligation is to buy land that must be sold or buy back land that has already been sold, so as not to let property be alienated from its original line of ownership. Now this is complex, but it was a law that's worth us just understanding. So if we look at Leviticus first, Leviticus is very near the beginning of the Bible. So Leviticus chapter 25, verse 25. And again, I'll be ahead of you because I've marked the page, of course. As all good ministers do lots of cheating. So Leviticus 25, verse 25, it says this: "If any of your Israelite relatives go bankrupt and are forced to sell some inherited land, then a close relative, a kinsman redeemer, may buy it back for them." Okay, so that's in Leviticus. Then in Jeremiah, now Jeremiah isn't always easy to find. In fact, when I was looking for it, when I was planning, I went round the houses trying to find Jeremiah, because Jeremiah is later in the Old Testament, much later. So you have to turn a great big wodge of the Bible to find Jeremiah. So Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 7 to 10. And this is just a story illustrating this redeemer, kinsman, and how it works so that we grasp it. So this is Jeremiah 32, verses 7 to 10. "Your cousin Hanamel, son of Shallum, will come and say to you, 'Buy my field at Anathoth. By law you have the right to buy it before it is offered to anyone else.' Then, just as the Lord had said he would, Hanamel came and visited me in the prison. He said, "Buy my field at Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. By law you have the right to buy it before it is offered to anyone else. So buy it for yourself." Then I knew for sure that the message I had heard was from the Lord. So I bought the field at Anathoth, paying Hanamel 17 pieces of silver for it. I signed and sealed the deed of purchase before witnesses, weighed out the silver, and paid him. Now just hang on to that story, because this is going to be significant a bit later on in the book of Ruth. This is Jeremiah's story, but it gives us this idea that the closest relative is the kinsman redeemer. They have this right to buy the land. So just hold on to that, because that is very significant later on. But for here, back in this story, what we really understand is that Naomi sees Boaz as a redeemer, someone who potentially offers the promise of protection and help. And for the first time, Naomi has hope for the future. Dare she dream that perhaps even the family name of Elimelech can be preserved through the child of a Levirate marriage to Ruth? We don't know where Naomi's thoughts are rushing at this moment, but we are not surprised that she encourages Ruth in verse 22. Are we? "This is wonderful," Naomi exclaimed. "Do as he said. Stay with his workers right through the whole harvest." So she encourages Ruth with much enthusiasm to remain in Boaz's field. And she stays throughout the barley harvest and then again through the wheat harvest. So the barley harvest in the spring and the wheat harvest in the autumn. So this is a period of several months and a time within which Boaz and Ruth will see each other. They will talk with each other. They will spend time with each other every day. But Naomi has even more detailed plans up her sleeve, and we will discover what those plans are next time in chapter 3. So it's a wonderful story, isn't it? And it makes you want to quickly find out what's going to happen next. So join me next time as we look at chapter 3 of this beautiful book of Ruth.